Welcome to the Teens Behind the Scenes webinar series. My name is Lindsey R. Barr, and I'm one of the dramaturgs for the program. Teens Behind the Scenes is a program of the National Theater Foundation dedicated to providing teens in the Washington, D.C. area with access to Broadway touring productions and professional insight into performing arts careers. In this series, we interview theater professionals to learn more about what they do, how they do it, and how they got to where they are now. Joining me today is Hana Sharif, currently the Artistic Director of Hana Stage here in Washington, D.C. Hana, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Hana Sharif. My pronouns are she, her. I am an artistic director who has been passionate about creating opportunity for new American voices for my entire career. I started a theater company when I was 19 years old in undergrad at Spelman College, Nasir Productions. And that really, will say, set the stage for everything else that has happened in my career. I ran that company for a number of years before moving into the regional theater world and navigating through. Until I came to this point of being artistic director at Hana Stage. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that journey, but when I think back to what has excited and propelled my career, it really goes back to being 19 years old and believing fundamentally in the power of art and believing that I could make art that made a difference, and not waiting for someone to give me permission to do so.
That's amazing. So let's take a step back and just sort of try to define as best we can, knowing that is a pretty all-encompassing position at times. What is an artistic director and what does an artistic director do?
So, an artistic director is responsible for fulfilling the mission of your theater. That includes curating the season. So, all of the shows that you see in the season, it includes hiring the creative teams. So you're choosing the playwrights whose voices you're going to amplify. You're putting together and matching the right directors and designers with the playwright. It's casting. It's supporting the way the story of the story is being told. So helping craft the narrative around how you're going to market the shows to make sure that your community knows what's happening inside of your theater. Another part of artistic direction that people don't talk about, but it's a huge part of the job, is also fundraising. None of the work that happens in the nonprofit theater happens by accident. We live in a country where we don't actually have a ton of federal support for our nonprofit arts. And so much of the work, it's nonprofit because the cost of a ticket actually doesn't cover the cost of producing. So much of the work is actually going out and locally, regionally, and nationally raising money to support the work of those artists. And that is a shared job between the artistic director and the managing director or executive director, but a really important part because an artistic director is essentially the face of the theater, right? The voice of the theater. I believe that the best institutions have a very focused and unified vision, and that vision is first articulated by the artistic director, but should be able to be articulated by anyone who works in the institution if it's unified. And part of the job of an artistic director, I think that you have to speak many different languages. And so part of my job is to not just define vision, but to understand how it's practically applied, what it means for everyone who works in every level of the organization, and then being able to translate that vision in the language that each department speaks. Because the development department speaks a very different language than the carpenters, which is a different language than the front of house staff. But everyone has to be able to understand not just where we're all moving, but the role they play in that. And that is another important part of the job of the artistic director that I think sometimes falls a little farther down the list when we talk about what this work is.
Yeah, I really love that you're talking about the importance of being an artistic steward for the organization as the artistic director, but not shying away from the reality that that means you are an executive leader of the organization who has to engage in all of these executive tasks that require collaboration and cooperation in the interest of sort of stewarding that vision that I think, to your point, isn't always at the forefront when we're talking about artistic directorship.
Absolutely.
So can you talk about your path to becoming an artistic director? And we can think about that broadly as sort of how did you end up at Hana Stage? Or feel free to explore whatever you'd like in terms of getting you there.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I would say is that I am really fortunate in the fact that I actually started my career as an artistic director. So I was the founding artistic director of the theater company that my friends and I created in college. And that is the start of my professional career, right? I think that sometimes we will look at our histories and we'll say, oh, well, my career began when I joined the regional theater movement. That's not where my career began. I never would have entered the regional theater community if I had not been building art in a company surrounded by artists. And there are so many of us in the business that started with our own small, scrappy theater company. So one of the things I say to all young artists who are thinking about their careers is that you don't have to wait 20 years into your career to lead. The why you do this work is fundamentally important. So my journey began, I was always a theater kid. My mother says I was a very dramatic child. Uh, but I really did. I found myself I was a playwright and an actor. And I found that writing helped me answer the questions I had about the world and myself within the world. I found theater as a space where I could explore all kinds of emotional truths that I felt in my kind of day-to-day life I was required to kind of remain distant from in order to thrive and succeed in the way that I was being raised and encouraged to succeed. And so when I needed to go to a place where I could really understand complexity, I turned to theater to do that. And when I went to college, I did not think that I was going to be a theater artist. Theater was something I did for love. It was something I was passionate about, but I wasn't sure that it was a career. Um, I continued to do theater when I started my freshman year at Spelman College because I loved it, but I thought I was going to be a civil rights attorney. And then there was a major shift that happened in our university where the head of department left. And a group of us understood that there would be a major transition within the department, and we were concerned about our education falling through the cracks. And we also were really passionate about stories that we thought were missing in the canon, right? I remember thinking like, we need to write ourselves into existence. Like we are having an experience that we're not seeing reflected on the major regional theater stages. We would go to, I was in Atlanta. The Alliance was a wonderful institution at the time, was helmed by Kenny Leon, the great Kenny Leon. And so there were very cool plays happening, but they weren't reflective of some of the questions that we had about our identity and what it meant to be like coming of age in the early aughts, right? In the late 90s, early aughts. And so there was a sense of like, well, we can tell our own stories. And we started to build together. We started working as like actors, writers, directors coming together and just like forming a thing. We would requisition space. We had to do all the jobs. You had to do the marketing job, the Devo job. Like there's like 6 people trying to put up a production. So like if the trash needed to be taken out, I was the founding artistic director. You know what I was also? I was also the trash woman, right? Like I was also the person doing that. What I learned is that how collaborative this art form is. What I learned is how important it is to have no ego in the work. What I learned is that when you center the art and the audience, magic happens. And we kind of 19 sophomore year built a manifesto around the kind of work that we wanted to do and why we wanted to tell stories. And then we went to work doing it. And it didn't matter that our audiences were sometimes 20 people and sometimes 100 people. We were taking over the like Shakespeare stage in the Rockefeller Plaza on Spelman's campus, or renting out a tiny little storefront next to, a bar in Atlanta that had been empty forever, and renting lights and borrowing lights and costumes to make the work happen. But I really believe that my entire career is possible because of those early years of cutting my teeth and forming a methodology to the work and a why for the work that I carry with me now. When I decided to go to the regional theater, it was an intentional decision, and it wasn't about my career. I remember 5 years into my time as artistic director of Nasir Productions, waking up and realizing that I could be doing the same work 20 years from now. and that maybe we grow the theater being like $100,000. Like that felt like an impossible thing to run a theater with an annual operating budget of $100,000. I currently run a theater with an annual operating budget of about $21 million. So it's just like you think back at 19, it was like maybe one day, or at 21, maybe one day. But what I realized is that there was something that first of all of us who formed that initial company were all artists who were just trying to make work that we believed in, but we hadn't been trained in the business of theater. And what I realized is that there were regional theaters, these multi-million dollar theaters that knew something that I didn't know. That there were people who were there who had a skill set, who weren't actors who became administrators necessarily, but there were people who were actually trained in marketing, trained in development, trained in producing, and that I wanted to know what they knew. And so I was going to go into the regional theater as a sponge to absorb as much as I can about how the business worked, and then take that learning back to my small, scrappy theater company so that we could grow bigger, stronger, faster. That was the impulse. And what happened, as my mother often says, is you plan and God plans, and God is the best of all planners. But, I got into a position that I thought I was going to be in for a year, and opportunities, doors kept opening. Opportunities to grow kept opening. More responsibility came, more access, and I kept learning. And so my commitment was to stay until I stopped learning. And every time I thought it was time to go, another door would open that would give me another opportunity to strengthen my skill set. Until I found myself 10 years into working as a producer and artist in the regional theater movement. And I began to understand the power of having a curatorial seat at the table where you're the largest artistic theatrical voice in a community, and the power of being able to help frame the narrative that could help build bridges, healing, and connection in community. And for me, if you go back to what I said, like I was 19, I was going to be a civil rights attorney. What I say is that I chose to be an artist rather than a civil rights attorney because at the time, at 21, when I was graduating from college, I thought that art was a stronger tool than the law to transform community. And I'm still in this work because I believe in its power. And that is what drives me as an artistic leader. And I would say that I took a step back to become a producer and then become a director of new play development and then an associate artistic director. And then there was a moment where I said, do I want to run a major regional theater? Is that a dream? And when I realized that it was, those doors opened too. And the other thing just to say that is true is that there wasn't a me before me. There had not been a Black woman running a major regional theater in this country until I was announced as artistic director of the Repertory Theater of St. Louis, just 6 or 7 short years ago. And that is a bittersweet thing to understand because there are so many women who pave the pathway. So I approach my work as an artistic leader with a deep sense of responsibility and accountability to the communities that we serve with our art, to the generations of communities that have paved the way for all of us to exist, And so I hold this work not just as being artistically fulfilling, but morally and communally important and sacred.
There's so much to unpack in everything you've just said, but I think I want to pull on the threads. 2 threads really stick out to me. And the first one is sort of this relationship between being a civil rights attorney and doing the artistic work of leading an organization, and that they aren't actually as different as perhaps they sound on the surface, right? It does feel like an activism in a way that feels vitally connected to a community in the interest of storytelling, right? Which feels really salient. But I also want to pull up on the thread that you're talking about a little bit about the regional theater movement and sort of thinking about legacy. Because for the students who might not know, Arena Stage is at the forefront of regional theater in the country, started the whole movement, right? And was started by a woman. And so thinking about that, knowing that you have paved a path for artistic directors of color, to sort of, and women in particular, to lead these organizations. Some have followed to varying communal success, right? I sort of mean that to say that not all artistic directors have been welcomed openly, particularly women of color in their communities, right? And so I'm just wanting us to sort of think about how you are navigating this conversation in your own space as artistic director, sitting at the helm of an organization like Arena Stage, which in a lot of ways has blazed a path for not only theater, but sort of women in theater.
I feel like this position in this moment is really kismet. I feel so fortunate to lead Arena Stage. And part of that is its revolutionary roots, right? Zelda Fitzchandler, who is our founding mother, one of the godmothers of the regional theater movement. And one of the things I just want to say is really important is that the regional theater movement was created by women. Zelda, Nina, and two or three other women who decided that they were going to create homes for art outside of New York. Everything, really, the entire industry was centralized in New York. And we're about to hit our 75th anniversary season. So 75 years ago, there was a dream of what it could be. And Zelda, who I learned about in school as one of these kind of foremothers of the American regional theater movement, one of the things that is so powerful is not only was she an artistic leader and a founder, she was also a primary educator. She's a long legacy at NYU where she taught many generations of artists. But she was a revolutionary scholar and thinker about theater. And so 19 is one of those catalytic years in my life. It's the year that I started my theater company, but it's also the year that I discovered the writing of Zelda Fitzchandler. And I discovered her essays and went on a deep dive because I was fascinated by her mind. Here is one of the women who founded the regional theater movement, and I was reading essays where she was challenging the things she created. She was challenging the bias that exists. She was challenging what happens when artistic enterprises become businesses and the responsibility of maintaining a relationship with audience. She was having conversations we're having today as if they were happening for the first time. There are essays, there are a couple of books that have recently been released, including one by Todd London that is a fabulous collection of her essays. And there's an essay I was reading that she wrote during the Vietnam War that she could have written yesterday. And so at 19, I discovered these revolutionary writings of a woman whose entire legacy birthed the thing that I was pursuing as a business and an art form. And I told people when I was 19, well, if I ever run a theater company that's not my own, it has to be Arena Stage. Right. And many, many moons later, it is amazing to be here and to be standing on what I think is really sacred ground and to be at an institution that's entire journey, not just through Zelda, but also through the great Molly Smith, who led this theater before me for 25 years and is an icon of the American theater as a legacy leader, and what she has built and evolved and how she really stood on the foundation that Zelda created and elevated that foundation, and to be able to now stand on the foundation she's created with the responsibility of continuing that evolution is humbling and exciting. And also, I feel so privileged to be at an institution that was meant to be integrated from the beginning. So the other part of the legacy of Arena is one, Arena's first theater was in the round. And it was because Zelda had a belief that there was no way to escape when you were in the round, that there was something magical that happened with the audience experiencing each other in collaboration and connection to the art on stage. Also, when Arena Stage was created, it was intentionally created to be an integrated space for both artists and audiences at a time where it was illegal. Right. So during segregation, she created a company that was going to break the segregationist laws by intention at its birth. And so in some ways, unlike many other regional theaters, I am in a space that was built to prepare for the idea that I exist and could lead. And in many other institutions, including, I feel very fortunate, the Repertory Theater of St. Louis, which is the first regional theater in the country to say that a Black woman would be its leader. It was radical in some ways, not radical in others, because I certainly, of my generation, am highly, qualified and capable. But we're willing to break through a glass ceiling that heretofore had not been broken through. And it was integration in 2018, if you think about that, right? Integration in 2018. That ground had not been fertilized from its root to believe in the leadership in my body, like most of the American regional theater. And so many of my colleagues, not just Black, Latinx, Asian American, who are breaking through these glass ceilings, are entering into spaces where there is a desire for the art, for universality of art, and for art that makes space for the lived reality of all of us, in understanding that there's more that connects us than divides us. But the businesses and the institutions were not built to understand that leadership. And so there's a growth and a stretching process that is difficult and challenging, and in the best of times, and extraordinarily challenging as we also navigated COVID. And the first time we saw the global shutdown of our industry ever. So there was a conflation of complications happening at the same time the industry was actually breaking open and understanding that the best of the leadership of the American theater was actually quite diverse. So many of us faced unexpected, perhaps expected challenges in the role of leadership, which was not about our skill set or our ambition or our ability to serve community, but more about helping shift the paradigm of people's unconscious bias around what leadership can look like. And what I will say is, I am not having that experience that so many of my colleagues across the country have had, and that I have had in other positions, in this position, because I'm actually standing on ground that from the beginning believed in the power of diverse ingenuity and the idea that the complexity of all of our lived experiences is actually at the center of our power and our public good. So it is transformative to be in a theater and with a board and with a staff that is all rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, I think there's a reason that Arena Stage is so often the case study for when people are talking about the regional theater movement, or simply to your own point, right? Like talking about what it means to build an organization with intentionality toward inclusion, right? As opposed to sort of, to your own point, figuring out how to do it on the back end and finding various levels of success with that. I remember being in undergrad and like in every class when we learned about regional theater, it was like an arena stage. And we're going to go down the street and we're going to see a show there. We're going to do the thing there because it's so important to theater, bringing access to theater too, right? At a fundamental level across the country, this idea, to your own point, that New York does not have to be the nexus of artistic creation. And in fact, there's actually a really brilliant way that we can think about creating community alongside these institutions as they pop up across the country. And I think we're just really lucky that here in DC, we have many of them. Arena Stage certainly at the charge there. So I'm curious if you've talked a lot about the importance of starting that theater company when you were 19 years old and thinking about how important that time was, both artistically, but sort of just in collaboration with your colleagues. I'm wondering if you can pinpoint maybe one of the things that you found really surprising when you started that endeavor when you were 19 years old. And perhaps that thing still shows up in your work today, but just sort of when you first got to be an artistic director, what was perhaps one of the most surprising things to you?
How many decisions needed to be made on a daily basis. That, when you are in school and you're kind of working through the lens of your role, like, oh, here's my role, I'm going to learn these lines. And, we all think about the kind of sexy roles and, oh, the director, I'm the actor, I'm the creative. But actually, it's a giant machine to produce a play. And if you don't have 100 employees to do it and you've got 4 or 5, like at the end of the day, someone's got to say, it's going to look like this. We have this much budget, and these are the ways it's going to be parsed out. And that there's a level of, when it comes to like actually being artistic director, the level of responsibility is real. And that was a surprise to me at 19. It is no longer a surprise, but it is very real. The other thing is that anything that happens at the institution is a reflection of the artistic director, right? So, and I think even now, most people don't think about like the way you do your job. Like ultimately, the accountability comes back to the person who's the face of the theater, right? So if someone's tickets get messed up in the system, I will get the letter, and the letter will say, "You messed up my tickets, artistic director." Right. And so even if I personally haven't touched the tickets, I'm still accountable for the experience that every patron has. Right. I'm still accountable for how we deliver on all of our work. And that accountability is an important responsibility. And I carry that responsibility of helping support everyone who supports the work, and making sure that we are crafting and creating the best experience for everyone who gives of themselves, their time, and their treasures to be part of our family. And also it means, taking restorative action when we fall short of that, because we're all human and we do, but then there's still a responsibility to make sure that it's made right. And in terms of like the surprise of it all, I think it's less a surprise and more of a thing that no one talks about that is actually fundamental, right? I am one who doesn't personalize mistakes, but I make sure that I learn from them. And I encourage learning. Learning is fundamental, right? So like, it's a complicated business. Some things will happen the way we think they will. A huge part of producing is being ahead of the curve to know where we might go off the rails, and then like making sure we like shape shift so that no one else even figures out we were going to go off the rails. And being able to do that and hold grace, right? There are parts of being an artistic director that can feel pretty thankless, and that's okay, because that's what happens when you step into executive leadership, right? It's like there is the kind of like forward-facing, visible part of the job, and then there's all the work underneath. And I am most thrilled by the work underneath. I love the problem-solving pieces of it. I love when there are fewer problems to solve, but I also love the problem-solving piece of it. And if you don't love that, if you're not willing to kind of be in the mud, then you may find artistic direction not to be the most fulfilling job you could have in the American theater.
Yeah, I wonder, that actually leads really well into one of my questions, which is when you're thinking about being an artistic director, knowing that it is such a multifaceted job and there's so many things that exist both on the surface and underneath, as you're pointing out, what are some skills that you think, or experiences that you think have been really fundamental to your growth and success in this space?
I often credit Michael Wilson, who was my artistic director at Hartford Stage for many years, with helping me craft and strengthen what I think is the most important muscle I built as an artistic director, which is the ability to be a bit of a chameleon in terms of understanding that we talked about it earlier, this idea of like being able to translate vision. So in my first year at Hartford Stage, he made me the liaison to every department. So I was the artistic liaison to the production department, education department, marketing department, development department. I went to all the board meetings. And my job in those rooms, the way I often say it, is my job was to be able to articulate vision to the department that I was liaising with, but also to be able to bring back to the artistic director where there were complexities, where there was vulnerability, where there was fear, where we had pinch points for each department so that he could understand how his vision was actually in practice affecting the many different departments that had to come together. And that skill of being able to understand the interworkings and processes of each one of the departments that are necessary for the fullness of our work to happen is one of the greatest gifts I've been given. And it has made me, it is one of the things that I think helps me in my excellence in my work, right? Most people who work with me will say that I am exhaustive, that I look at every possible scenario and I'm able to do that very quickly because I've spent years crafting the muscle of being able to understand not just what the art is, but how every decision has a ripple effect through the different departments. And because I was required for the first 10 years of my career in regional theater to literally be able to translate this language to this language and this language to this language, I have developed a muscle that I think is really critical if you're an artistic director, of being able not just to talk about vision to different departments, but to know how to put the right people in the room and guide them to be able to communicate with each other. This system doesn't work if even one of the spokes falls apart. Like, this is truly I am my brother or sister's or siblings keeper, right? And so that sense of being able to be global in your understanding and also micro in your problem solving is I think a really important superpower for someone who wants this show.
So many brilliant nuggets of saying things that, as someone in theater, I've observed, but putting words to it is really incredible. And I could totally see how that is a direct growth of someone putting you in a position where you could experience that. That's, I think, really brilliant leadership. You've mentioned, I want to end as we sort of come to the end here, go back a little bit to community and thinking about regional theater, since you're talking about your time at Hartford Stage, and you have spent time in artistic teams at some of the largest regional theaters in the country, and certainly some of the most influential. And I'm wondering if, Hartford Stage you mentioned, St. Louis, Baltimore Center Stage you were at, and now you're at Arena. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you work with, become in community with the people in those locations when you come to a new institution. And I guess that could mean both in the institution itself, like the staff that work there, but also the community of the people and patrons who are joining you all to see the work that you're putting up. How do you approach those conversations? How do you work to integrate yourself both in the institution and in the community that these institutions serve?
I think that I have a practice of active listening. And I've had the opportunity to test different models of it throughout my entire career. After I left Hartford, I actually went to ArtsEmerson, and at ArtsEmerson, I was leading a research project looking at barriers to inclusion. Why don't African Americans in the Boston area go to the theater en masse? And so I put together a test group of a cross section of different ages and socioeconomic brackets and educational brackets of African Americans, and we went to the theater. We went to see something at every theater in the Boston area together, and that kind of research time, shout out to David Dower, who was once part of the Arena Stage family and then led at ArtsEmerson and was the one who invited me in to do this research, was really pivotal in terms of understanding that there is no one way to view community. So often, I think our regional model was like, we know what great art is and what you people need. and we're going to give it to you, right? It was a little missionary. And my career has been about actually like going into the many different communities and sitting down and having conversation. When I got to St. Louis, one of the first things I did is I hired a community organizer who had no roots in theater to join my artistic team. But they had lots of relationships in the many different spectrums of community in the city. And his job was to go and meet with folks and to set up conversations and opportunities for me to talk to people about how their artistic lives were being filled and what were the most exciting and meaningful things happening in their community, right? And where there were gaps. So that when we thought about how we serve community, that it wasn't just about the art that we're putting on stage, but also like, what are the programs that we're creating? If we have learning programs, are we just replicating what everyone else does in the country? Are we actually thinking about who we want to serve? And also, are we replicating something that someone else already does? So for example, when I got to St. Louis, someone asked me, because we launched a mobile unit in Baltimore that was going to like prisons and domestic violence shelters and juvenile centers, with great art. And they said, "Oh, are you going to launch a mobile unit to go serve prisoners in Missouri?" And I said, "Well, no, because there is the Prison Pipeline Project that already does that here." So as the head of the largest theater in Missouri, I certainly could launch a new program and probably get lots of press and PR and money for a program that basically is replicating what someone else has been doing for 20 years. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is use the resources of the institution to find out how we can support their work or how we can amplify their work. Do they need access to props? Do they need access to costumes? Can we do something to support this other organization that is serving this niche community, these niche communities, in a way that is good partnership and deepens their ability to do the work that they do best, right? And so, but you don't get to that if you come in having decided what people need rather than paying attention and listening. And then figuring out where there is need that we can fill. The other part of the thing that feels really exciting about the way that I kind of approach this work, for me at least, is I get to learn so much about the kind of ecosystem that we're joining. And oftentimes I see need that we are not actually best suited to serve. But then I use that understanding in my conversation with other arts organizations, with other social service organizations, with other community organizations that do have skill sets that can fill those needs, to say, "Oh, you know what? I was in this community, and actually, here's an area where there's real need that aligns with what you do. Have you ever talked to? Can I introduce you to?" Right? All boats rise together when we see ourselves not through the singular lens of solo ambition, but the understanding that the work that we do at Arena is part of a larger ecosystem that is not just other theaters, but the tapestry, this kind of like multi-layered tapestry of people with lived experiences and communities and other organizations with strengths. And that when we kind of bring together what we all do best, we create radical access and opportunity for development. And that is, so my approach to community is first about listening, then it is about assessment, and then it is about building and dreaming together. I am someone who thrives off of having always a dream space and an execution space. I would not pretend that I don't have extremely high standards, but those standards come from the import of the why we do the work. And my hope is to inspire people to reach higher than they've ever reached before in service of the people that are in our community.
I love that you're thinking about community, not only about patrons and people who may come to your space to see shows, but also about the organizations theatrically based or otherwise, that you can be in conversation with. It feels so often in certain areas, it can be like, oh, well, this theater does this thing, so we can't be involved with them, or they do this thing, so we can't sort of partner with them or think about that space. But it's really heartening to hear that is a part of your thinking about community.
Yeah.
So we're sort of at time here, but I want to end by just offering space. Is there anything that you want to make sure these students know about artistic direction, or just about the work being done at Arena? Anything you want to sort of leave our great high schoolers at the Teens Behind the Scenes program with?
I want to just say I'm so excited for the future of the American theater because of you. I look forward to meeting you. This is an open, direct invitation from me to you to come out to Arena Stage. I would love to meet and connect with you. I'd love to understand what in our art form is most thrilling for you. Because what we're building, everything I'm building, it's not for me or my generation. It's for the future. My job is to make sure that there's a strong foundation for all of you when you step into your roles as professional artists to be able to dream forward. So I offer that. What I will say about this season that you're invited to join us on is that it is a diverse season. It's a 10-play season. It's a large season with lots of new plays, and plays that really reflect the full spectrum of the American spirit. And I also have an open door policy. So if you have plays that you'd like to pitch, things you'd like to see in our community, please feel free to shoot them over to our info box at Arena Stage. I promise it will get to me. You are part of our ecosystem and part of our family. And I'm so grateful that you've tuned in. I am happy to be a resource to you in the future. And I look forward to seeing you at the theater.
Thank you so much, Hana. This was insightful, inspiring, generative, thoughtful, giving, all of the great adjectives that we can come up with. So thank you so much for your time. And that concludes our interview today with Hana Sharif, Artistic Director of Arena Stage at Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.